One stormy night, Nancy's life is turned upside down. After a near-death accident, she finds herself trapped between darkness and abyss, with an injured leg and no one to help her. But then something unexpected happens. The dog she had abandoned in the past, the same one she had treated cruelly, appears to rescue her. Loyal to the end, Bobby did not leave her behind, but what happens next changes everything. A journey of redemption, sacrifice and forgiveness unfolds, leading Nancy to question not only her survival, but the true meaning of love and forgiveness. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any exciting stories like this one. Here, each video is a journey of overcoming an emotion that you won't want to miss. It was a dark, stormy night. The rain hammered relentlessly against the windshield, obscuring the road ahead. Nancy's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white, her mind racing as the wind howled through the trees. The headlights barely cut through the sheets of rain, and every mile felt longer than the last. She knew she shouldn't be driving in conditions like these, but there was no turning back now. The meeting was important, too important to cancel. As she rounded a sharp curve, the tires hit a slick patch of road. The car slid. She slammed her foot on the brake, but it was no use. The vehicle veered off course, spinning out of control. Panic flooded her chest as the car swerved violently from side to side. Nancy fought with the steering wheel, desperately trying to regain control, but it was hopeless. Bang! The car slammed into something hard, jolting her forward. Her seatbelt pulled tight against her chest as the vehicle twisted, skidding along the edge of the road. Everything around her seemed to blur, the world turning into a chaotic whirl of sound and motion. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Nancy sat in stunned silence for a moment, her ears ringing from the deafening crash. She could hear the rain outside, now pounding harder, but inside the car it was eerily quiet. Her heart raced in her chest, and her breath came in shallow gasps. Her leg. She looked down, and the pain shot through her like 1,000 needles. She gasped, trying to move, but the sharp pain from her lower leg made her stop. Her foot was pinned beneath the dashboard. She tried to shift her weight, but it was impossible. The car was tilted at an angle, its front end hanging dangerously close to the edge of a steep cliff. If she moved too quickly, the whole thing could tumble into the abyss. Panic clawed at her chest as she fumbled for her phone. Her fingers were slick with sweat, and the device slipped from her hand, crashing onto the floor. The screen shattered. She cursed under her breath, frustration mounting as the storm outside raged on. She had no way of contacting anyone. Alone. Nancy closed her eyes for a moment, trying to calm her racing thoughts. Her heart pounded, and she could taste the bitter sting of fear. But as the seconds stretched into what felt like hours, another thought began to creep in, one that she had long since buried deep in her heart. Bobby. Her mind flashed to the dog, the one she had treated with cruelty. He had been her companion, her protector at one point, but her impatience, her bitterness, had driven him away. She had pushed him to the side when he needed her most, and now she was trapped. She could almost hear his bark in the back of her mind, a distant memory of a time when she had known real companionship. She had abandoned him, and now the reality of her actions was sinking in. Suddenly, she heard it. A bark. Faint, but unmistakable. Nancy's eyes snapped open, her heart skipping a beat. She strained to listen, almost not daring to believe what she had just heard. Could it be? In the midst of the storm, was it really him? She leaned her head against the window, peering into the darkness. The wind howled, the rain pounded against the glass, but that familiar sound, another bark, came again, closer this time. Her breath caught in her throat. Bobby? Her heart pounded louder now, both in hope and disbelief. She couldn't explain it. After everything, after the way she had treated him, how could he be here now? The sound of paws against the wet ground grew louder as a figure emerged from the darkness. Through the rain, through the blinding storm, a familiar shape appeared in the distance, a dog, moving quickly toward her. Nancy's eyes widened, and her chest tightened as she realized that it was really him. Bobby. The dog's coat was drenched, matted from the rain, but his eyes were full of determination, full of something Nancy had longed to see. It was a look of loyalty, a look of love. As Bobby reached the car, he let out another bark, more urgent now. He circled the vehicle, his body low to the ground, his eyes never leaving hers. He seemed to sense the danger, sense her fear, and despite everything that had happened between them, there he was, her former companion, coming to her aid. Nancy couldn't believe it. She could hardly breathe as the dog nudged at the door, whining softly, trying to reach her. His tail wagged once, twice, as if to say, "I'm here." Through the pain and the storm, she felt something else rising inside her. A glimmer of hope. Bobby, the dog she had abandoned, was now the only chance she had left to survive. The irony was not lost on her, her own betrayal was coming back to save her. She forced herself to take a deep breath, trying to calm her racing pulse, and with trembling hands, she reached for the door. If Bobby was here, there had to be a way out. There had to be. Nancy's heart raced as she watched Bobby circle the car, barking insistently. The storm raged around them, but in that moment, the world seemed to fade away. Bobby was here. Her mind couldn't fully process it. After all she had done to him, he was back, ready to help. She swallowed hard, her throat dry from the fear and the strain. Could she trust him? Could she really count on him after everything she had put him through? Her leg was still pinned under the dashboard, the pain intense and unrelenting, but as she looked into Bobby's eyes, she realized something: he had never stopped caring. The love and loyalty in his gaze cut through her guilt, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Nancy wasn't completely alone. Bobby barked again, more urgently this time, his tail wagging in quick, excited motions. She could see the determination in his eyes, his body low to the ground as he paced back and forth, as if assessing the situation. He wasn't just there to offer comfort, he was here to help. Nancy's breath hitched as she tried to move. Her leg was stuck under the metal, and even the slightest shift made her wince in pain. But Bobby wouldn't stop. He nudged the door again, pawing at it with frantic urgency. Okay, Nancy whispered to herself. I have to try. With a deep breath, she gritted her teeth and used her good leg to push herself toward the door. Every movement was slow, deliberate, and painful. But Bobby was there, nudging her hand with his wet nose, as if saying, I'm here, don't give up. The car felt like a prison, the rain pelting down relentlessly, but she knew she couldn't stay trapped here. The vehicle was teetering dangerously close to the edge. A single wrong move, and it could fall into the abyss. She couldn't wait any longer. Please, Bobby, she whispered through clenched teeth. Please help me. Bobby let out a soft whine as he looked back at her, his gaze full of understanding. He stepped back for a moment, his body tense, then bolted to the other side of the car, his paws splashing through the mud. Nancy watched him, confused, wondering what he was doing, but then it became clear. He was trying to find another way in. Bobby leaped up to the window, his paws resting on the sill as he gave another sharp bark. With surprising skill, he began to push against the window frame with his strong paws, forcing it open. The sound of the glass scraping against the metal was grating, but it didn't matter. Bobby was making a way for her. Nancy's heart fluttered as she realized what he was doing. He was trying to get her out. She moved her injured leg carefully, trying not to make the pain worse, and inched herself closer to the window. The pain was so intense that her vision blurred, but she forced herself to focus on the dog, the only lifeline she had in this moment. Come on, Bobby, she murmured. I can't do this alone. Bobby looked back at her, and with a determined look, he jumped down and darted to the rear of the car. Nancy watched in a daze, wondering what he had planned next. Her breath came in shallow bursts, the terror of the situation settling back in. She could see the edge of the cliff through the shattered window, and the darkness below seemed to call to her. Suddenly, Bobby reappeared, dragging something behind him, her jacket. Her coat, which she had left on the seat before the accident. With incredible effort, Bobby pulled it across the muddy ground and dropped it right in front of the car door. He pawed at it, and Nancy realized what he was doing. He was trying to pull her out of the wreckage. Nancy blinked in disbelief. The coat was thick, sturdy enough to help pull her, and Bobby, with all his strength, was trying to use it to drag her to safety. "Are you serious?" Nancy gasped, the words catching in her throat. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Here was Bobby, the dog she had wronged so terribly, now trying to save her life. With a new burst of determination, Nancy grabbed the jacket, ignoring the searing pain in her leg. She pulled herself toward the door, using the jacket as leverage. Bobby barked once, loudly, as if cheering her on, his paws digging into the wet ground as he strained to help. It was working. Every inch felt like a victory. The storm continued to lash at her, but it didn't matter. With Bobby's help, Nancy was inching her way out of the car. The pain in her leg was nearly unbearable, but she kept moving. She could hear Bobby's comforting barks, each one spurring her on, pushing her to keep going. Finally, with one last desperate effort, Nancy pulled herself free, rolling out of the car and onto the muddy ground. She gasped for air, her body aching, and her vision blurred with tears of pain and relief. But she was out. She was alive. As Nancy lay there on the wet ground, Bobby bounded over to her, his tail wagging in a frenzy of joy. He nuzzled her cheek, as if to say, "You did it." She could hardly breathe, her body aching in places she didn't even know existed, but she reached out weakly and stroked his drenched fur. "I can't believe you did this," she whispered, choking on her words. "I don't deserve this, Bobby. After everything." Bobby gave a soft whine, his eyes full of compassion. He licked her hand gently, and for the first time in a long while, Nancy felt a warmth that wasn't from the storm. It was the warmth of forgiveness. Her heart ached with regret for the way she had treated him. But in that moment, all of it seemed so small, so irrelevant. She had been given a second chance, not only at life, but at redemption. The car, still teetering on the edge, finally gave way, crashing down into the darkness below. Nancy turned to watch it disappear, but the moment was fleeting. She was here. Alive. And Bobby had saved her. For the first time in a long time, Nancy felt the stirrings of something deeper than guilt, something she hadn't known she needed. Hope. Nancy lay on the wet ground, her chest heaving with shallow breaths. The pain in her leg still throbbed, but the intense agony that had overwhelmed her earlier seemed to fade into the background as she looked at Bobby. His wet fur clung to his body, but his eyes were full of warmth and determination. The rain continued to pour, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. But for the first time since the accident, Nancy felt like she wasn't entirely alone. Bobby was there, his loyal presence a small comfort in the midst of everything. "Thank you," Nancy whispered hoarsely, her voice barely audible over the storm. She reached out to stroke his wet coat, and Bobby licked her hand in response. He nuzzled her face, his tail wagging weakly. This dog, this loyal creature, had saved her life. It seemed almost impossible to believe. She had been so cruel to him, had pushed him away when he needed her the most. And now, he had returned to pull her from the edge of death itself. For a brief moment, Nancy let herself feel something other than the raw ache of guilt, gratitude. A fleeting warmth spread through her chest. But then, just as quickly, the cold reality of her situation returned. The car, which had been teetering on the brink of the cliff, was now nothing more than a dark shape at the bottom of the ravine, swallowed up by the night. The cliff was too steep for her to see the wreckage clearly, but she knew what had happened. The car was gone. She had survived by sheer luck. By Bobby's incredible determination. But the storm showed no signs of relenting, and she still had no way of knowing if anyone was coming for her. Was help on the way? Or would she have to depend entirely on Bobby to find her a way out of this hellish place? As Nancy tried to sit up, the sharp pain in her leg made her gasp. She couldn't put any weight on it, and the blood from her wound had begun to soak through her pants, leaving a dark stain on the ground. She couldn't move fast enough. Tears welled up in her eyes, not just from the physical pain, but from the overwhelming sense of isolation. Bobby had brought her hope, but she knew it wouldn't be enough. She wasn't sure how much longer she could stay conscious, let alone make it out of the storm. "Bobby, can you find help?" she croaked, her throat dry. But the dog didn't respond. Instead, he looked over his shoulder into the darkness, his ears perked. Nancy's heart skipped a beat. What was it? Was someone coming? Was it rescue workers? She strained to hear above the storm, but the sounds of the rain were deafening. Then, as if in answer, she heard something. A voice. "Nancy." The voice was faint, almost lost in the howling wind, but it was unmistakable. It was a voice she knew. "Nancy, are you there?" Her heart stopped, and a cold shiver ran down her spine. It was him. Nancy tried to sit up again, but her body refused to cooperate. The rain and the pain clouded her thoughts, and it was all she could do to keep her eyes open. That voice, that familiar voice, echoed in her mind, sharp, bitter, and angry. It was Marco, her old boss, the man she had betrayed. The man she had wronged so terribly in the past. The man who, now, would likely be the last person she'd ever want to see. She had no idea how he'd found her or what he was doing here. But the unease that crept into her chest was impossible to ignore. He was out there, somewhere in the storm, and he was calling her name. Why? What was he doing here? She could hear him moving through the brush, getting closer. She tried to call out to Bobby, to get him to run, to lead her to safety. But before she could speak, Bobby gave a low growl, his posture suddenly tense. The hairs on the back of Nancy's neck stood on end. Marco's voice rang out again, closer now. "Nancy, I know you're out here." His voice was cold, calculating. "Don't make me find you." Nancy's blood ran cold. She had known Marco for years. He had been her boss, her mentor, even a friend at times. But the relationship had soured when she had sabotaged his efforts to take over the company, driven by jealousy and selfish ambition. In the end, her betrayal had cost him everything. He'd never forgiven her, and now, it seemed, he was here for more than just vengeance. Nancy tried to push herself to her feet, but her leg buckled under her weight, sending her crashing back down into the mud. Her breathing became shallow, her vision blurred. She could barely stay conscious, but she could hear Marco's footsteps approaching through the rain-soaked underbrush. Every step echoed louder and louder, filling her with dread. But Bobby was still at her side. The dog's growl grew louder, his fur standing on end as he bared his teeth in the direction of the approaching footsteps. Nancy, panic seizing her, realized that Bobby was ready to protect her. But she knew he couldn't do it alone. Marco was dangerous, he had always been dangerous. Just then, as if out of nowhere, Bobby bolted toward the underbrush, his body low to the ground. "Bobby!" Nancy gasped. She wanted to call him back, to tell him to stay, but she was too weak to do so. The sound of Marco's voice became clearer, and suddenly, Nancy realized the truth. Bobby wasn't just saving her from the accident. He was trying to protect her from something much worse. As she lay there, helpless and unable to move, she felt a wave of shame wash over her. Marco's betrayal, Bobby's loyalty, and everything that had led up to this point, it was all culminating now. And, as Marco drew closer, it became painfully clear to Nancy that she had made far more enemies than she could ever have imagined. Nancy's heart pounded in her chest as Marco's voice grew louder, his footsteps coming closer with each passing second. The rain lashed against her face, stinging her skin, but it was nothing compared to the icy grip of fear that clenched her gut. Marco was here. He had found her, and the storm wasn't the only thing threatening to swallow her whole. Her eyes darted around in panic, searching for a way out, but there was nowhere to go. She couldn't walk. She could barely sit up without feeling like the weight of the world was crushing her. Her only hope was Bobby, and yet, he was gone. The dog had darted into the underbrush moments earlier, growling fiercely at the approaching footsteps. Where was he now? Bobby? Nancy called weakly, but her voice was drowned out by the storm. Bobby, come back. But the silence that followed was deafening. The growl had stopped. The rustling in the trees had ceased. It was as if Bobby had vanished into the night, swallowed by the very darkness that surrounded them. Nancy felt a chill run down her spine. Had Bobby left her? No, she couldn't believe that. Not after everything he had done for her. He wouldn't abandon her now, not when she needed him most. But as the rain continued to pour down and the storm raged on, the only thing she could hear was the steady approach of Marco. His voice rang through the air, cold and steady, but with a hint of something more, anger, resentment, and perhaps something darker. Nancy. The way he said her name, with that chilling edge, sent a wave of nausea through her. He was getting closer, his figure now visible in the storm's light, his silhouette cutting through the rain like a shadow. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes that blended with the night, but the unmistakable gleam in his eyes was visible even from a distance. Nancy's heart skipped a beat. He was here. Her eyes frantically scanned the area for any sign of Bobby, but all she could see was the storm, the trees bending violently in the wind, and the rocky cliffside where her car had once been. There was no movement in the underbrush. No sign of the dog who had saved her life. And then, just as Nancy thought she could take no more, she heard something, a bark. It was faint at first, almost lost in the howling wind, but there was no mistaking it. Bobby. Nancy's breath caught in her throat. He wasn't gone after all. The bark came again, louder now, and with it a sense of urgency, as if Bobby was calling her, urging her to move, to get up, to do something before it was too late. Bobby? Nancy whispered hoarsely, her voice barely above a breath. She tried to push herself up again, wincing in pain as her legs screamed in protest. But this time, there was something different. Something in the air felt lighter. She turned toward the sound of the barking, her eyes straining to see through the storm. And there, at the edge of the tree line, she saw him, Bobby, emerging from the darkness. His fur was matted with rain, his body soaked through, but his eyes were clear and bright, filled with the same loyalty and determination that had pulled her from the wreckage earlier. He stood there for a moment, looking back at her, and then took off running, disappearing into the thick underbrush. He wasn't just running, he was leading her somewhere. Nancy's heart raced with a mixture of relief and confusion. Where was he going? What did he want her to do? But there was no time to question. Marco was getting closer, his figure becoming more distinct in the storm's light. He was too close now for Nancy to stay hidden, and she knew if she didn't act quickly, she might not have a second chance. Bobby, she called again, but her voice broke through the rain and wind in a desperate plea. Wait for me. Bobby's bark came once more, this time softer but more persistent. He was still out there. He hadn't abandoned her. He was showing her the way. With what little strength she had left, Nancy forced herself to her feet, pushing through the pain in her leg. She limped toward the direction Bobby had gone, one shaky step at a time, using the underbrush for support as she hobbled forward. The storm was deafening, but all that mattered was following Bobby's lead. She trusted him. She had to. The moment she began to move, she heard Marco's voice again, louder this time, sharp with anger. "Don't run from me, Nancy." His words sent a shiver down her spine, but it wasn't just fear she felt, there was something else. A deep, gut-wrenching realization. Marco wasn't here to help. He wasn't here to rescue her. He had come for something far worse. Her breath came in quick, shallow gasps as she forced herself to move faster. She had to get to Bobby. She had to trust that the dog would get her out of this, that he would show her the way to safety. But every step she took seemed to take her further into the unknown, deeper into the darkness of the storm. Bobby's bark echoed again, and Nancy's heart leaped as she followed the sound, her leg protesting with every step, her body trembling from exhaustion and fear. But she kept going, driven by the hope that Bobby had one last miracle to offer. And then, as she stumbled forward, something strange happened. The storm seemed to let up. The rain slowed, the wind died down, and for the first time in what felt like hours, Nancy could hear the soft rustling of leaves beneath her feet. The ground felt firmer, the trees less oppressive. She looked up, barely able to process what she was seeing through the haze, and there, in the distance, she saw a light. It wasn't much, just a faint glow, but it was enough. It was the path she had been searching for. Bobby was ahead, waiting for her. She was not alone anymore. And as she hobbled toward the light, toward the safety that awaited her, she realized something else. The storm had broken. The dark, suffocating weight that had gripped her since the accident had lifted, if only for a moment. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. Bobby had never left her, even when she thought he had. And now, as they both made their way toward whatever hope lay ahead, Nancy understood that perhaps there was more to this night than just survival. There was redemption. And maybe, just maybe, she could find it. Nancy's breath came in ragged bursts as she hobbled forward, the pain in her legs still excruciating but pushed to the back of her mind. The storm had finally begun to subside, the rain easing to a light drizzle, but the oppressive darkness still hung heavy over the landscape. Yet, the flickering light that had appeared in the distance was growing brighter, and she could almost taste the relief that awaited her. Bobby trotted ahead, his steps confident, guiding her through the last stretch of the woods. With every step, the forest seemed to recede, and the faint glow grew stronger, revealing the shape of a small cabin tucked against the hillside, sheltered from the storm. Nancy's heart skipped a beat. She had no idea who might be inside, but it didn't matter, it was safety. It was the first real sign of hope she had since the accident. Her leg gave way again, and she nearly fell, but Bobby was there, nudging her with his nose to steady her. "Hold on, boy," Nancy whispered, her voice hoarse. "We're almost there." As they neared the cabin, she could hear the sound of voices, men's voices, coming from inside. They didn't sound threatening. In fact, one of them even sounded familiar, and Nancy's heart leapt when she recognized it. "Nancy?" It was a man's voice, but it wasn't Marco. She didn't know who it was, but the voice was concerned, not hostile. The door of the cabin opened, and a man stepped into the frame, his face illuminated by the dim light inside. He was tall, with broad shoulders, dressed in dark, wet clothing, and his face was stern but soft. "You okay?" he called out. Nancy's body trembled, and for a second, she wondered if this was a dream, a safe place, a reprieve from everything that had happened. Bobby, seemingly sensing her exhaustion, nudged her forward. She took one slow step, then another, before her legs buckled beneath her, sending her tumbling to the ground. The man rushed forward, catching her in his arms before she hit the wet earth. "Hey, take it easy," he said. "You're going to be fine. We've got help coming." The man carefully helped her to her feet and led her inside the cabin, where a fire crackled softly in the hearth. The warmth from the fire hit Nancy like a wave, and she closed her eyes for a moment, letting it wash over her. But before she could say anything, a voice interrupted. "What the hell happened out there?" Nancy's eyes snapped open, and her heart froze. It was Marco's voice, harsh and biting, unmistakable in the way it sliced through the air. She had been so distracted by the appearance of the rescuer that she hadn't noticed him, Marco, standing just behind her, a few feet away from the cabin door. His eyes were dark with rage, and the look on his face was enough to make her blood run cold. The rescuer immediately stepped in front of her, shielding her from Marco's glare. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice low and steady, though Nancy could feel the tension in the room tightening. "You've got no business here, man." Marco's voice dripped with venom as he squared up to the stranger, taking a threatening step forward. The rescuer didn't flinch. "She's not going anywhere with you." Nancy, still trying to process everything, struggled to find her voice. "What's going on?" Her words felt weak, foreign in her mouth after the ordeal. She turned to the man who had brought her in, searching for some explanation. The stranger's gaze softened, and he held up a hand to calm her. "You're safe here, miss," he said, his voice gentle. "I'm a local, just trying to help. But that man out there, I don't know what he's after." Nancy's mind swirled. Marco. The man who had once been her boss. The man she had betrayed. The man who had somehow found her, even in the middle of the storm. He was dangerous, and even now, as he stood just outside the cabin, she could feel the weight of his hatred bearing down on her. Bobby, who had been standing by her side, suddenly stiffened again, his eyes trained on the door, growling low in his throat. Nancy's heart pounded. "Bobby, please." But before she could finish her sentence, the door flew open. Marco stepped into the cabin, his eyes narrowed, his fists clenched, and the storm behind him seemed to follow, still raging. The man who had been helping Nancy immediately blocked his path, his body tense with anticipation. "You don't belong here," the rescuer said firmly, standing tall and unafraid. "You've been following her. I don't know what game you're playing, but you're not taking her anywhere." Marco smirked darkly, his lips curling into a bitter grin. "You don't get it, do you? She belongs to me." The tension in the cabin reached a breaking point. Nancy could feel it, could feel Marco's dangerous hold tightening around her, but she couldn't understand why he was so determined. She had left his life behind, severed ties with him. What did he want from her now? What could he possibly still have over her? Before Nancy could speak, there was a knock at the door. The stranger turned abruptly, his eyes widening in recognition. "It's the paramedics." Relief flooded Nancy's chest at the sound of the words, but Marco didn't move. He stood still, his fists still clenched, as if he was waiting for something. The rescuer gestured toward the door, signaling to the incoming paramedics. A moment later, 2 uniformed paramedics entered the cabin, followed by a man who was obviously in charge. The leader of the group scanned the room, taking in the situation. "Who's in charge here?" the paramedic asked. His eyes landed on the rescuer, who nodded grimly. "I am. She's hurt. I found her out in the woods." Marco, now visibly agitated, stepped forward. "I'm her emergency contact. She's with me." The paramedic's eyes narrowed. "I'm afraid you're going to have to step back, sir. We're taking her to the hospital." Marco's face twisted in anger. "You don't understand. She's mine. I'm the one who—" "No," the rescuer stepped forward again, his tone firm. "She's not going with you. You need to leave. Now." The tension in the cabin was unbearable. For a long moment, there was silence, broken only by the storms howling outside. Then, to everyone's surprise, Marco turned on his heel, his eyes burning with fury. "You'll regret this," he hissed, storming out of the cabin. Nancy, still dazed and confused, watched him leave, her mind spinning. What had just happened? The paramedics, now focused on her, began to move swiftly. They checked her vitals, bandaged her wounds, and prepped her for transport. As they helped her onto the stretcher, she locked eyes with the rescuer one last time. His expression softened, and he gave her a reassuring nod. "You're going to be okay," he said. But Nancy couldn't help but feel that the danger wasn't over. Marco had been there for a reason, and as they loaded her into the ambulance, she knew this night was far from finished. There were secrets she still didn't understand. Secrets that, somehow, Marco was tied to. As the ambulance doors slammed shut, Nancy closed her eyes, trying to ignore the gnawing fear in her gut. The storm wasn't over. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind only the soft patter of rain on the leaves and a crisp, cool breeze that cleared the air. The world around Nancy seemed quieter now, as if the tempest had taken with it not only the violence of the storm but also a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. She wasn't sure how long she had been walking. She had lost track of time, only focused on putting one foot in front of the other. Bobby led her steadily forward, his tail wagging, never leaving her side. His presence was a quiet comfort, steady, constant, as though he understood the journey she had ahead of her. When they reached a small clearing, Nancy collapsed to the ground, her leg giving way beneath her. She breathed heavily, exhausted from the effort, but she wasn't afraid anymore. She had made it. She had survived the storm, the cliffs, and even the shadows of her past that had haunted her. Bobby lay beside her, curling up to keep her warm as the rain continued to drizzle lightly over them. Nancy's thoughts drifted to the path she had walked, the one that had led her here, through the pain, through the betrayal, through the storm. But as she closed her eyes for a moment, trying to regain her strength, a new thought emerged: her father. Marcos. Nancy's mind began to wander back, past the pain of the accident, past the storm that had nearly claimed her life. She thought about the man who had been by her side for as long as she could remember, her father. Nancy hadn't spoken to him much in recent years. Their relationship had become strained, pushed apart by her own decisions. Her mistakes. Her reckless ambition had cost her more than just her job, it had cost her the trust of the one person who had always supported her, who had always believed in her. She thought of how her father had begged her to be careful when she first started working for the company. How he had warned her not to let ambition cloud her judgment, but she hadn't listened. She had been too focused on winning, on proving herself, and in doing so, she had alienated everyone who cared about her. Even Bobby, the one being who had never let her down, had been abandoned in her pursuit of selfish goals. Now, with the storm behind her, Nancy felt a pang of guilt that she couldn't ignore. Would her father even want to see her again? After everything? After she had hurt him? She felt a rush of shame, as though the storm inside her wasn't quite over yet. But she knew there was something she had to do before she could move forward. With Bobby by her side, Nancy pushed herself to her feet. Her father was the only person who could help her find the peace she so desperately sought, and if there was any chance of redeeming herself, she needed to face him. The hospital. Nancy's arrival at the hospital wasn't dramatic. There were no flashing lights or rushing doctors. It was more of a quiet arrival, with paramedics carefully handling her injuries and bringing her inside. The surgery had been painful, but necessary. The broken bones in her leg had been set, but her internal injuries were more complicated. Yet, through it all, Nancy felt a strange sense of calm. Once the surgery was done, Nancy was settled into a private room. Her body was sore, wrapped in bandages, but there was a new, strange peace within her. She wasn't alone anymore. And then, when the door opened, her father walked in. Marcos had aged. His hair, once dark and full, was now streaked with gray, and there were deep lines etched into his face. But his eyes were the same, warm, understanding, yet with a sadness that Nancy hadn't noticed before. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Nancy's heart was pounding in her chest, the weight of everything between them crashing down on her. She wanted to say something, to apologize for all the pain she had caused, but the words wouldn't come. Her father stood at the foot of her bed, looking at her, his eyes flickering between her injured leg and her face. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and soft. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his eyes scanning her face with concern. Nancy swallowed hard, struggling to find the right words. I'm okay. I mean, I'll be okay." She tried to smile, but it felt like it wasn't her own. It's been a lot. Everything has just been too much. I didn't realize how far I'd gone until it was too late." Her father nodded slowly, sitting down in the chair beside her bed. His hand rested gently on her arm, a gesture that surprised her, given the distance that had grown between them. "That's the thing about life, Nancy," he said quietly. "It has a way of showing us who we really are when we least expect it. But it's not too late. It never is. You're here. You're alive. And that's something worth fighting for." Nancy closed her eyes, feeling the weight of his words settle deep within her heart. She had been so focused on her own ambition, so caught up in the rush to prove herself, that she hadn't seen the toll it had taken on everyone around her, especially her father. "I'm so sorry, Dad," she whispered, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "I hurt you. I hurt Bobby. I hurt myself. I was so selfish, and I don't know how to fix it." Marcos squeezed her hand gently, his voice steady and forgiving. "Nancy, you're my daughter. There's nothing you could do that would make me stop loving you. I've made mistakes too, you know. I'm not perfect. But we both have time to fix things. We just have to start. Together." Nancy's heart clenched at his words, and a wave of gratitude washed over her. For the first time in years, she felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward, not just for her, but for all the broken pieces of her life. She looked at her father, and for the first time in a long time, she felt hope. "Together," she repeated, nodding. "We'll fix it together." The days following her surgery were slow, filled with pain, but also quiet moments of reflection. Nancy spent much of her time in the sterile hospital room, staring out the window at the dull gray skies, listening to the soft hum of machines, and feeling the weight of everything that had led her here. She was alive. But more than that, she was beginning to realize that survival alone wasn't enough. Healing wasn't just about fixing her broken leg, it was about fixing the fractures in her heart, the ones that had torn apart her relationships, her sense of self, and her connection to the world around her. Each day, her father was there. Marcos never left her side, except to rest in the hospital's lounge or take short walks to stretch his legs. He would bring her soup and magazines, trying his best to ease the boredom that came with the confinement of the hospital room. But what mattered most wasn't the food or the small talk, it was his presence. It was the way he would sit beside her, watching her as if he could see the invisible wound she carried. "Are you feeling any better?" he asked one evening as he carefully adjusted the pillow behind her head. The question wasn't just about her physical state, it was about the slow, steady process of her healing. Nancy nodded slowly, but her eyes were distant, troubled. "Physically, yeah, I guess. I'll be okay eventually." Her father studied her for a moment, then nodded, as if he understood there was something deeper. Something unspoken. But emotionally, she continued, her voice catching. "I don't know how to fix it, Dad. I don't even know where to start." Her father sat back in the chair, his expression softening. "You don't need to have all the answers right now, Nancy. It's okay. You've been through a lot. But what matters is that you're here, and you're starting. Starting is the hardest part." Nancy stared at her hands, the fingers curled slightly from the bandages that still covered part of her leg. She was still so weak, so fragile, yet a small ember of something bright began to glow in her chest. Hope. Her thoughts drifted to Bobby. She hadn't seen him in days. He had stayed with her for the first few hours after the accident, never leaving her side, but once the hospital staff had arrived and she was taken inside for surgery, he had disappeared. She knew he was nearby. Bobby always came back when she needed him. Her father must have noticed her distraction, because he spoke again, his tone gentle. "Have you thought about what you're going to do when you get out of here?" Nancy looked up at him, blinking. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what's next? After this is over. After you've healed." Nancy's eyes wandered to the window again. Outside, the world was gray, drenched from the storm, but there was a calmness to it now. A kind of stillness that matched how she felt inside. "I don't know," she murmured. "But I can't go back to being the person I was. I can't be that selfish, arrogant woman anymore. I've lost so much. And I've hurt so many people. I don't even know where to begin." Her father smiled faintly, though there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. Sometimes, redemption isn't about doing something big. It's about doing the small things, making amends, accepting responsibility, and learning from the mistakes you've made. You don't need to have it all figured out right now. But you need to start living differently. And you need to start forgiving yourself. Nancy felt a knot form in her throat. Her father's words resonated deeply. She had spent so much time running from her mistakes, from the people she had wronged, from her own regrets. But forgiveness, both giving and receiving, was the only way forward. The shelter and new purpose. The days passed, and Nancy's recovery moved forward. Her leg healed slowly, and while it still pained her to move, there was a new determination in her movements. The moment she was discharged from the hospital, Nancy didn't go home right away. She knew she had to make a stop first. Her father drove her to the animal shelter. The same shelter where, years ago, they had adopted Bobby. The same place where she had first learned about the importance of compassion, loyalty, and responsibility. The shelter had always been a place of healing for her father. He had worked there as a volunteer before his retirement, and it was a cause that had always been close to his heart. Nancy wasn't sure if Bobby would be there. She wasn't even sure if he would want to see her again after everything. But she knew that, in order to move forward, she had to confront the consequences of her actions. She had to show Bobby that she was truly sorry. As they walked through the familiar doors of the shelter, the smell of animals, of wet fur and hay, filled her nostrils. It felt like both a homecoming and a reckoning. Nancy felt a pang of guilt, but there was also a strange sense of clarity as she walked past the cages of dogs and cats. She had come here with a purpose, to make things right, starting with the one animal who had never given up on her. The one being who had shown her that redemption, though difficult, was possible. And then, from behind a row of cages, she saw him. Bobby. His eyes were still the same, deep, brown, and filled with recognition. He saw her, and for a moment, they simply stood there, staring at each other. Then, Bobby let out a soft bark, as if saying, "It's you." Tears welled up in Nancy's eyes. She slowly crouched down, her leg protesting with the movement, but she didn't care. She held out her hand, trembling. "I'm so sorry, Bobby," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I was wrong. I hurt you, and I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know that I love you. I always have." Bobby didn't hesitate. He padded over to her, nuzzling her hand with his wet nose, as if to say, "I know." He licked her face, his tail wagging vigorously. Nancy laughed through her tears, her heart swelling with emotion. In that moment, she understood that this was what she had been seeking all along. Not just survival, but connection. Healing. The love that Bobby had always given her, despite her flaws, was the most profound redemption she could ever hope for. Her father stood beside her, watching with a gentle smile. "You see, Nancy? It's never too late." And for the first time in a long time, Nancy truly believed it. Weeks had passed since the storm, since the crash, since everything had come crashing down. Nancy's body was healing, her leg still sore but no longer the debilitating injury it had once been. She had learned to walk again, with a cane now instead of crutches, each step a reminder of the long road she had traveled. But more importantly, her heart was healing, and that was something she hadn't expected to find. She had spent those weeks in the hospital, talking with her father, Marcos. They had started slowly, rebuilding the trust that had been broken over the years. There were tears, of course. Apologies on both sides. Nancy had apologized for the things she had done, how her ambition had driven her to hurt him, how she had abandoned Bobby, and how, in her pursuit of success, she had lost sight of what truly mattered. But more importantly, Marcos had apologized too. He admitted that he had been too hard on her at times, that he had been blinded by his own fears of losing her to the same mistakes he had made. Together, they had begun to heal, piece by piece. And through it all, Bobby had been there. By her side. The dog had stayed with her through the worst moments, never leaving, never faltering. His loyalty had been the bridge that connected her to her past, to the person she once was, and to the future she was now trying to build. Now, as the rain subsided and the sun peeked through the clouds, Nancy sat on the small porch of the house where she had spent so many years of her life, a house that had once felt like a prison to her. But now, it felt like a home again. She was not alone. She was surrounded by the people who mattered, her father, Bobby, and the slowly, but steadily, rebuilding sense of self-worth she had once lost. Bobby was lying at her feet, his head resting on his paws, his eyes soft with the contentment of knowing he was loved, truly loved. It was a bond that couldn't be broken, no matter how far she had fallen or how lost she had become. "Bobby," she whispered, bending down to scratch behind his ears. "I don't think I'll ever be able to repay you for everything you've done." Bobby wagged his tail, his eyes never leaving hers. It was as though he understood. It was as though he knew that all of it, every step, every moment, every sacrifice, had been worth it. He had saved her life, yes, but more than that, he had saved her from herself. Nancy smiled, the tears that had once been born of pain now replaced with those of gratitude. "I don't deserve you, you know that." Bobby let out a small woof, as if to say, "You do now." Nancy laughed softly, feeling lighter than she had in years. Her heart was full in a way it had never been before. She had learned that true success wasn't about what she achieved or how much she had in the bank. True success was about relationships, about trust, loyalty, love, and the willingness to make things right when they've gone wrong. The door creaked open behind her, and she looked up to see her father stepping out onto the porch, a mug of coffee in his hands. "Hey, kiddo," he said with a warm smile. "How are you feeling?" Nancy leaned back in her chair, her gaze shifting from her father to Bobby and back again. "I'm good. I'm really good. Better than I ever thought I'd be." Marcos sat beside her, taking a sip of his coffee. "I think we've both been given a second chance," he said quietly. "A chance to do things differently." Nancy nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know. I've been given more chances than I deserve." Her father smiled, his eyes glistening with something that resembled pride. "That's the thing about second chances, Nancy. They're not about deserving them, they're about taking them when they're offered and making the most of them." For a moment, neither of them said anything. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, though. It was peaceful. The storm was truly over. "We've got a lot of work ahead of us," Nancy said after a while, glancing at her father. "But I'm ready. I want to make things right, with you, with Bobby, with myself." Marcos placed his coffee cup down, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder. "I know you will, Nancy. You already have. And then, with a gentle push, he stood and stepped back into the house. Nancy stayed outside for a while longer, breathing in the fresh air, letting the last remnants of the storm wash away. It felt like everything had come full circle. What had once seemed like the end had become a new beginning. The wreckage of her past, the storm that had almost taken her, was now a distant memory. She had found her way back. Bobby got up and trotted over to her, his tail wagging in a happy rhythm. She reached down and scratched behind his ears again, this time with no hint of hesitation or guilt. Only love. She had learned what true love meant, not just the love between her and her father, but the bond with Bobby, the unconditional love of a dog who had never given up on her, no matter how hard she had pushed him away. Nancy stood up slowly, feeling the strength in her legs returning, feeling the emotional weight of the past slowly lifting. With Bobby by her side, she knew she was ready for whatever came next. She had the love of her father, the loyalty of Bobby, and most importantly, the ability to forgive herself. She wasn't the same person she had been when the storm began. She was someone new. Someone who could face the future with the understanding that it wasn't about perfection. It was about growth, redemption, and the willingness to change. Together, with her father, with Bobby, and with the newfound peace inside her heart, Nancy took the first step into her new life, one that was full of hope, love, and the promise of better days ahead. If you liked this story and want more content like this, leave a like, share it with someone you know will be moved by it, and of course, subscribe to the channel. Together, we will explore inspiring stories and moments that touch the heart. Until the next video.